Hi, this is Paul, and I'm continuing on my series on the commentary on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, and I'm going to jump around a little bit. This is again in biblical series 3, and I'm planning on doing a piece on origin, which is kind of the second comment that Jordan Peterson makes in that. But I've been digesting the let's find it. I've been digesting the I don't want to tip off my hand. This Jordan Peterson Transliminal 2015 video, and I've listened to that 3 times in a row now, and it's really been helpful in terms of I think that's probably the best video that I've seen of Peterson working in a semi-linear way. And that video has really, at this point now, I've been studying Peterson for about 8 months, and since doing these videos for about a month now, really starting to focus in, and I think I'm just starting to get a handle on him in some ways. And that video in particular has been super helpful. So now, as I continue to go through the biblical series, lights are coming on, pennies are dropping, things are falling into place. I'm understanding, I'm getting a better picture of why he's repeating himself, why he's working through these things, why he's rambling the way he is, and where he's going with all of this. So let's jump in. And this is so I'm calling this biblical series B. I'm trying to work out a numbering system, which a number of you have asked for, to try to put these videos better in order. They do follow the playlists as I put them in. And I want to jump into towards the end of the biblical commentary series 3, where Peterson talks about Marduk.
Know it or not. That's Marduk. So the story of Marduk, I'll just give it to you very briefly. Tiamat and Apsu are locked in embrace at the beginning of time. Goddess of salt water, god of fresh water, together. Chaos and order, right? They give rise, masculine and feminine, they give rise to the world of the elder gods. And those are, to me, they're primordial motivational forces. They're something like that. And their rage and their lust and their love and all these things that possess us that are there forever. And they're...
Now again, there's so much in here that I want to talk about, because this, I mean, what he's connecting there connects with so many other things. You can think about the Apostle Paul and principalities of powers, and so all of there's connections between all of these things, and then the masculine and the feminine, which I'm starting to get an idea of what Peterson talks about with masculine and feminine, and beginning to understand, okay, how does all of this connect up with his, with the more political, cultural agenda that he has.
They're out in the world acting. And they carelessly slay Apsu, their father. And they're making...
Careless is important there. They carelessly slay him. And you think about these little gods in the Greek sense of the word that inhabit us in terms of lust and anger. And so that really is genius, that they carelessly slay Apsu, their father.
Making a racket, and then they kill Apsu. And then Tiamat gets wind of that. And that's Tiamat right there. By the way, she's kind of a rough-looking creature, and she's the mother of all things, and so she's not very happy about it.
And again, if you look at Tiamat, she's a composite beast. Now, at some point we're going to have to talk about the book of Daniel and the composite beasts that come out of the sea in the book of Daniel. And again, if you look at this representation and you think about Peterson's, cat, snake, bird. I mean, she's not got a lot of snakes in this image, but in a number of the other images, she is a sea monster. And but she's got claws, and look at her claws, and they're almost hands, but she's got feet like raptors and claws like lions and a beak like a bird and wings so that she can fly. So again, she's this composite monster that now Marduk is going to fight. But look at Marduk too. I mean, he's got wings and he's got tools, and so we're going to see this epic battle.
About this, her children have destroyed structure itself. Plus, they're noisy and careless, and so she thinks, all right, just like Noah.
Okay, her children have destroyed structure itself. And again, when you think about Peterson and the archetypal fathers, how the father brings order, and the in the New Testament you would call it the lusts of the flesh. the lusts of the flesh destroy order. And again, as a pastor, I see this all the time with people. How do people sabotage themselves? Well, it's so often these lusts of the flesh that the Greeks called gods that would come in and possess and inhabit us. And it could be Cupid, which is love, or it could be lust, and so on and so forth. So again, all this archetypal mythological imagery at play, and it's not only mythological, but we see it playing out in our lives, which is actually the real purpose behind myth, and why we love seeing movies, and why we love myths, and why we love reading People magazine to watch these people who are godlike celebrities in our culture. They're powerful and beautiful, and the normal rules don't pertain to them, but they can't keep a marriage together because the internal gods of lust or addiction or depression take them, and off they go. And so this is replayed in Apsu and Tiamat.
Just like the God that brings the flood to Noah. Exactly the same idea. Tiamat comes back and says, yeah, okay, enough is enough. I'm going to take you out. And she makes this battalion of monsters and puts the worst monster there is at the head of the battalion. His name is Kingu. He's like a precursor to the idea of Satan. And she lets the gods know, hey, I'm coming for you. And so they're not very happy about this because they're gods, but like, yeah, she's chaos itself, right? She gave birth to everything. This is no joke. And so they send one god out after another to confront her, and they all come back with their tails between their legs. There's no hope. And then one day there's a new god that emerges, and that's Marduk. And the gods know, as soon as he pops up, they know he's something new. Remember, and this is happening while the Mesopotamians are assembling themselves into one of the world's first great civilizations. So all the gods of all those tribes are coming together to organize themselves into a hierarchy to figure out what proposition rules everything.
Okay, now pause right here, because we're going to get into this, because one of the peoples that the Babylonians will eat are the Hebrews and Israel and their gods. And what we're going to see is that, in a way, Babylon eats Israel, but it's kind of like in the Matrix when when Neo kind of, these they're godlike, they're part of the program, when they kind of attack the people who are coming into the program and they kind of explode them. Well, Israel's going to explode Marduk, and this shouldn't happen by the script. And so Peterson is right, and this is, I haven't been able to find and locate this where Peterson talks about this polytheistic appropriation of the gods. So these ancient Near East nations believe that the kings were proxies of the gods. Now I'm going to go off script a little bit here and see if I can let's go back to Chrome. Let's put me in the corner. Let's put Peterson in a window. Let's do a Google image search. And see, now I even forget what I was searching. Oh yeah, the Hammurabi stele, and you've probably heard of Hammurabi's code, but most of you probably haven't seen the stele, and this is where the code comes from. And you can see the let's see, view image, let's get it taller. You can see here's all the writing down here, and here's where we get Hammurabi's code. But what do we have here? We have the God giving Hammurabi the code. And now obviously you have in Sinai the Lord giving Moses tablets of stone that possess the law. But now what's interesting is that this relationship, and again Walton talks about this isn't something Israel borrows from the culture. This is the culture that Israel inhabits. And the God gives the people the law. And here the God gives Hammurabi the code and the law, and the people are supposed to follow the law. And Peterson talks about that in this video, and we're going to get back to that a few times. But what's key here is that the human nations, the tribes, the peoples, these entities, nations, that's a modern word, but these nations, these peoples are proxies for the real issue, which is the gods. And this shows again the ancient priority that the material is a creation and dependent upon the metaphysical. And when we talk about origin in the Greeks, we're going to see that dominantly, because that then gets played out in Plato, that the forms are eternal and the instances in the flesh within the age of decay are temporal. Every love you have will end in betrayal or death, but love itself, held in the heavenly in the forms, will not decay. Every horse you know will die, but the form of horse will remain in the flesh. Now, Aristotle changes the script on this a bit, but this assumption in the ancient world that the physical is secondary and what we would call the spiritual is foundational and primary, and the physical is derivative. And so therefore the gods are the big deal and the people are the working out of the gods, and the direction flows from heaven to earth, which is obviously why they had astrology, and why, if you wanted to know what was coming on earth, you had to look up into the stars and see the movements, and then you figure out, just like we in California, when we want to know what our weather is, we look out over the Pacific. Well, in the ancient world, if they wanted to know what will be happening in meat space down here in the physical world, you look up into the stars, and when you see the stars move, you say, aha, we know what's coming. We can see it in the stars, just like here in California. When we want to know our weather, we look out over the Pacific. So, back to Peterson. Oh, you see that I jumped too quickly. And go back to which tab I had him in. Okay, here we are. So let's keep going.
And so Marduk is elected by all the gods, and he says, look, I'll go out there and I'll take on Tiamat, but here's the rule. From here on, you follow me. I determine destiny. I'm the top god. I'm the thing at the top of the hierarchy.
Now that gets played out between the peoples. And when we get into the assimilation process of the ancient world, Babylon plays this out with Israel. Marduk is the top god. The Lord is his servant. Because Babylon and her armies have conquered Israel. Therefore, the armies of Babylon must be greater. And this is all being worked out. And
all the other gods say, hey, look, no problem. You get rid of chaos, we do exactly what you say. Now, Marduk, he has eyes all the way around his head, and he speaks magic words. Those are his primary attributes. And so he takes a net, and he goes out to confront Tiamat. And he encloses her in a net, which I think is so cool because it's an encapsulation, right? It's a conceptual encapsulation. He encloses chaos itself in a conceptual structure. He puts it in a net, and then he cuts her into pieces, and he makes the world.
Now, another thing to remember here, something that I mentioned back in my my video about chaos and Walton. What's interesting here, and I'm going to do more research on this, is that Walton makes the point in his book, Genesis 1 as Ancient Cosmology, that the conflict myth is a secondary development, a personification of these primary creation metaphors of separation and differentiation. That's interesting, because one of the things that sometimes I do a class for a friend of mine who wants me to introduce Christianity into his university class that he teaches. One of the things I note when I go back to the creation myths is one of the differences between, say, Genesis 1 and Babylonian creation accounts, and almost all other, or many other creation accounts, is the element of violence, where, here you have Marduk controlling chaos, putting it in a net, slicing up his mother, as it were, and using her body then as, in a sense, the firmament in which to create the world, and then people are made to be servants of the gods. And what's interesting, as Walton points out in Genesis 1, is that, first of all, God is dealing with order, but this isn't even a fight. He simply commands it, and order comes into line. And we're going to see how this plays out then when it comes to Israel and the nations. And so that this God doesn't set up a world and say, okay, I need people to feed me. John Walton notes that what's interesting and different about the biblical account is that people, the creation is made in such a way as to be habitable for people. And so God, in a sense, the God of the Israelites, had people on his mind right from the start. Now, the human rebellion is going to make a difference in that, in terms of the relationship between chaos and order. And in a sense, they are kicked out of the garden, and the balance between chaos and order is overturned. And now humanity itself has to wrangle with the thorns and the thistles. And the women in their productive state have to wrangle with frustration in childbirth. And again, the language in Genesis 3 between what the man has to deal with in the field and what the woman has to deal with in terms of childbirth are parallel. And so what you see here is that these two stories are from the same culture. In other words, they're dealing with all of the same issues, but the stories are taking things in slightly different directions. Okay, back to Peterson.
And then he creates human beings to inhabit that world and to serve the gods. And he creates human beings out of the blood of Kingu, the worst of the demons. And that took me, it's a Colin DeYoung, who was a student of mine, helped me figure that out. I thought,
Colin DeYoung, I want to know who you are. Did you grow up Christian Reformed? Because that's a Dutch name. And if you grew up Christian Reformed, every time you hear a Dutch name, you say, are you one of us? Or maybe you're RCA, a cousin. But let us know, Colin DeYoung.
geez, that's pretty damn pessimistic. It's like, what exactly... It's like a fall metaphor. It's like the idea of original sin, but our joint conclusion with regards to that was that human beings are the only creatures in creation that can truly deceive. Right? We have the capacity for evil, just like it says in the Adam and Eve story. We can actually do that, and that's why we're made out of the blood of Kingu, the king of the demons. We are the thing that can deceive, that can twist the structure of reality.
And here you also have another differentiation in terms of the biblical story. In a sense, humanity is fallen royalty, but they're yet royalty. They're made of the dust of the earth and the breath of God. They're not made from the blood of demons.
Well, so Marduk. Now, the Mesopotamians had an emperor, right? And the emperor was the avatar of Marduk. That's what made him emperor. He was only an emperor if he was going to be Marduk. He had to be a good Marduk, which meant he had to confront Tiamat, chaos, and cut her up and make order out of her pieces. And what the Mesopotamians used to do at the...
And again, he tells this story a number of times, and it's a great story, and those of you who watch his videos all the time know exactly where he's going. But you'll also notice that, again, for the Hebrews, the kings are the viceroy of the Lord. And in fact, this goes all the way back to Genesis 1, in the image of God, that humanity is, in a sense, God's representative on the earth, and to be a good representative on the earth, you have to submit to the king. You have to submit to the one who is ahead of you, the one who is above you. Now, this obviously takes different shapes in our modern world, where we say, no, I am the boss of me, and there's no boss beyond me. But then, of course, we have all of our hierarchies that we absolutely must deal with, and Peterson will go very deeply into that. It gets into the beginning of the Heidelberg Catechism, which begins, what is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, which is completely opposite of, say, an American creed, which would be, what is your only joy in life? That I am my own, that I am free to do whatever I want. And that shows this dramatic shift of modernity, even from the medieval world.
The New Year's celebration, they'd go outside their walled city, and that's explored territory versus unexplored territory. They'd go outside their walled city into chaos, and they'd bring all the statues that represented the gods, and they'd act this out.
They bring the statues that represent the gods. Now, what's not going to happen among the Hebrews? Well, you're not going to have any statues of the Lord. And if you do, and I'm going to get into the Old Testament books in a little bit, you're going to get into trouble. But again, I mean, this is why Peterson has been so helpful, because he's helped me put a lot of this stuff together in terms of, okay, now when I'm reading the Bible, especially the Hebrew Scriptures, things are falling together, and they're connecting out in interesting ways with the rest of the ancient Near East.
Because they're trying to figure something out, right? They're trying to figure out what this means. They're acting it out. And then they'd take their emperor, and the priest would make him kneel, and they'd take all his king uniform off, his emperor uniform off, and make him kneel and humiliate him and nail him with a glove and say, okay, how were you not a good Marduk this year, right? And then he'd recount all the ways that he was inadequate in confronting chaos, and then they'd do the celebration, and Marduk would win, and the king would go sleep with a royal prostitute.
Now, again, pay attention to sleeping with the prostitute. Think about the Gilgamesh epic and Enkidu, and how Enkidu is tamed by the prostitute of Great Walled Uruk. So, again, read Gilgamesh.
The reason for that was, it's the same idea as St. George pulling the virgin from the dragon. It's exactly the same idea, that if you encounter the reptilian chaos, you can extract something out of it with which, if you unite, you produce creative order. That's what they were acting out. And that was the basis for the Mesopotamian idea of sovereignty. It's so smart. It's so unbelievably smart. And, you know, the Mesopotamians had a massive influence on the civilizations that then had a massive influence on us.
Now, and if you don't believe that, read Jared Diamond's great book. Why can't I think of it right now? But you know what Jared Diamond wrote, and how in many ways story and culture radiated from this ancient Near East, in many ways on the heels of domesticated cattle and sheep and pigs and wheat, and you know, and so yes, these stories are foundational, and as Peterson says many times, makes Jung's observation that we don't have ideas have us, and you know, we don't have stories have us, which again for me makes is the devastating critique of postmodernity that says there's no overarching narrative. You can't say that statement without implicitly making an overarching narrative statement. It's simply a function of language. And this was a point I made in the comment about science, that perhaps you can do science in terms of pure mathematics, but you can't communicate that to another human being that doesn't know that language properly. So the minute you try to engage in any scalable way with regular people, you are within the storyverse because it's simply built into language. It is unavoidable. Remember where we started out? The medium is the message, and what medium you use will shape and even govern what is happening.
One of the stories of how the notion of sovereignty itself came to be. It's the evolution of the idea of God. That's one way of thinking about it, but even more importantly, it's the evolution of the idea of the redemptive human being, right? And that's taken to one of its conclusions, well, in the story of Buddha, but also in the story of Christ, the idea of the perfect individual. And the notion is, well, that's the word that speaks truth into chaos at the beginning of time to generate habitable order that is good. That's the story. And so with that...
That's the story. So with that, let's jump back to the PowerPoint. Now one of the things that I've been monkeying around with is one of the things that you get is you're going to have to begin to ask, well, when did these biblical texts arise? And if you dive into this world that I live in, boy, that's a big debate, because we don't know who wrote these things. We don't know, and so there's tremendous debate. And what you have to do is really up your resolution in terms of this and say, well, did these texts arise during David's realm? And how does the text of Genesis relate, let's say, to the text of Deuteronomy and those issues? And so one of the things that we're going to have to dive into is this question of Israel at the dawn of her empire, and the relationship between Israel and empire, and the relationship between God and empire. Because remember, and I'll pull up the stele here. This in the ancient Near East is the relationship. Who are people? People are servants of the gods, but now there's nuance within this, because in many ways Marduk creates people in order to serve the gods. And if you look at ancient temples, well, what were the ancient temples for? Well, you bring food offerings to the god. And why do you need to bring food offerings to the god? Because the god needs to eat. And then you read in the Hebrew scriptures, and they are saying things like, well, first of all, you may not make a representation of this god. Well, why not? And actually, if you Google online, let's say Google, why do Hindus continue to worship idols, and you will find statements like, well, idols are really helpful for people in their religion because you can, once you have something in your hand, you can feel it better and you can relate to it. And so why would the Hebrews not do this thing which would really help them be more religious? Now think about that for a while, and that will blow your mind. And then, of course, that gets dragged into Protestantism, and I come from an iconoclastic tradition. Why are our sanctuaries so bare? Now, technically, you only violate the second commandment if you make an image of the Lord. And when I say the Lord here, I mean the tetragrammaton, the name of the Lord. And so you can draw a picture of Jesus, because Jesus, according to the book of Colossians, was the icon of the invisible God. But this is where we're going into this, that in the ancient Near East you had the gods and they were images, and you had all of this. And so this was the world that they were living in. But now, one of the things that and over the last number of years, I decided that as a pastor, I was tired of jumping in and out of all these little series, and I really wanted to just preach on whole books of the Bible, because the Bible is in fact a library. And so then I decided, well, so many people don't really know a lot about the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, as Christians call it. So I was going to start right there in the Bible. And so in a sense, I started Peterson's biblical series before I ever heard of Peterson. I started in Genesis, and I've been working through it, and right now I'm in Kings, and I'm doing the Sola Scriptura series right now, which, if you're watching my Rough Drafts of Sunday videos, you know what's going on there. But after that, I'm probably going to go back to 2 Kings, and then we're going to go back to Elisha and all of those things going on. But it forced me to kind of go through the Bible sequentially. And one of the things that you realize, that, as Peterson has said many times, this is a very strange library, because it's also been set up in a certain way, and the process by which it was set up and the books were ordered is fairly mysterious to us. And as I mentioned before, there's unending debate about the books themselves and how they arose, and that gets into tribalisms, because fundamentalist Christians have different agendas from modernist Christians, and their debates with the scholarly community. And if you get into biblical studies, these debates are never ending. But one of the things that I noticed was that these books, their focuses and their agendas change as they go through. So if you read the book of Judges, for example, the book of Judges is obsessively preoccupied with the exclusive devotion to the Lord. And so the pattern of the book of Judges, if you've ever read the book of Judges, is very familiar, that God brings them into the land, but the people are disobedient. And they're very disobedient in terms of, they're always getting attracted to the neighbor gods. And basically how this works is, you come into the land and your crops aren't doing so well, and your buddy who's been living there longer and isn't circumcised leans over the fence and says, "Hey buddy, you know your problem here. You're doing these sacrifices to the Lord, but this land right here, this land belongs to Baal. And so if you do your sacrifices to Baal, then your crops are going to grow. Then your herds are going to multiply. Then your wife is going to have sons. Then Baal's going to be, and Baal basically kind of means the boss. And then Baal's going to, keep the neighbors at bay and let your armies win. And so what you really need to do is work with the Baals. And so, Israelites, just like everyone else, are religious consumers, and they're always looking for the best deal, and they're always looking for the more powerful God. So they look to the Baals. But then the book of Judges says, oh, no. The Baals aren't in charge. The Lord is in charge. And then calamities come. And Israel then becomes, in bondage again. In Egypt they were in slavery, but now they're in slavery in their own lands to the Midianites, and then later the Philistines, who will be, a serious challenge to them, because the Philistines are much more cosmopolitan people. They came into the land, they've got iron working, and the Israelites don't, and the Philistines are monopolizing it. So So then the story goes that the Lord raises up a judge, and these judges are not necessarily moral heroes. I mean, think about Samson. He's kind of the epitome of the judges. And he's got no self-control. He can't keep his, he can't, the wrong head keeps doing the thinking, and he falls into trouble with the women. But even with all of this stuff, somehow the Lord uses him to bring victory over their enemies. And then Israel has this religious revival, and they say, the Lord is God, and we'll follow him. But then that generation dies, and the next generation listens to their neighbor over the fence and begins following the Baals, and round we go. And this is the story of the book of Judges. And then it ends with this horrendous story, which is actually a redux of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is important because, if you're a tribalist of any kind, it's always convenient to blame, issues on foreigners so you can build high walls and keep them out and all of this stuff that we deal with all the time. But what happens when Israel, and it's actually Gibeah, the home of Saul itself, that commits this atrocity to the Levite's concubine? And the image of the story at the end of Book of Judges is that Israel is not only just like the other nations, she's the worst of the other nations. The story is archetypal. And then you have, after the Book of Judges, you have this, just one of the loveliest books in all of creation, the Book of Ruth, which has all of these cross pressures that are dealing with, are the Moabites evil? Yeah, but this ancestor of David, and later this ancestor of Jesus, she was a Moabitist, and her morality outshone that of Naomi, who turns into be this bitter, faithless woman who is not only a religious consumer, but she's conniving and oh boy, let's get a shot at Boaz here because, we can make the monies. And Ruth is this beautiful character, and this beautiful story how this noble Israelite and this noble Moabitess come together, and the Lord uses this union to rescue his people from themselves. And so it's a lovely interlude after the Book of Judges. But then when we get into the Book of Samuel, you might think, okay, we're going to go back into Baalism and concern about it, but we don't. You get into the Book of Samuel, and the real issues are corruption. Now Saul is portrayed as being devout. Saul is very religious. Saul is very devout, and he's not going to the Baals. And only at the end of his corruption does he actually sink to find the witch at Endor to try to call up the spirit of Samuel. But the issue in the Book of Samuel is not the foreign religions, and it's even not the foreign peoples. And this is why people read the Bible and they say, oh, the Bible, well, they have an extremely low resolution view of the Bible, and say, oh, the Bible is all this dogmatic, blah, 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 blah. The Bible is anything but that. Is this long, complicated, nuanced conversation about all of these issues that grips us, and sometimes gives dogmatic answers and sometimes gives nuanced answers. But here's the thing. Our life is filled with dogmatic answers that we must hold and nuanced answers that we must ponder. That's human life. And what we find in the Book of Samuel is that, it's not the foreigners and the foreign gods that are the great threat to Israel. It's corruption. And Peterson talks about this wonderfully when he talks about, getting the instantiation, the human instantiation of the absolute confused with the absolute. And in many ways, that's what the book of Samuel is about. And right away in chapter 8, when the elders want a king, they want this new political technology that's going to solve all their problems. And Samuel, first he takes it personally, and the Lord says, no, you take it personally. This is about me. Their complaints are about me, but give them a king anyway. What do you mean, give him a king? Yeah, give him a king and let him know what a king's going to do. Because a king's going to tax them. The king's going to take the best of their sons and the best of their daughters for his bed. And he's going to take the best of their crops and the best of their herds. And you're going to want him to be your junkyard dog to protect you from the Philistines. And it isn't going to work. And that's exactly the story of Saul. But then the Lord picks a man after God's own heart. But even with respect to these themes, look at David. David has David in some ways cozies up to the Philistines and becomes a lieutenant in the Philistine army. And then there's a crisis in that late in the book. But David has wives from Israel and wives from outside Israel, as does Solomon. Solomon's going to get dinged for it. We don't hear anything from David. Who do you think Bathsheba was? Uriah the Hittite. Was Bathsheba an Israelite woman? We don't know. David's army, his personal bodyguard, that gets him out of a scrape again and again. Read the list of who they were. These are not Israelites. And why does David have this kind of cosmopolitan personal army? And how on earth does that fit into the broader conversations of Israelite particularism? Again, the Bible is incredibly nuanced, and all of these issues that we deal with, should we build a wall? How do we regard people who come from shithole countries? All of these issues are dealt with in the Bible, and we've been having a long conversation with these for years, and this is exactly why Peterson is dead right in saying to people who are dismissive of religion as mere superstition, well, that's I understand why you say that, but it's not a very high resolution engagement of that reality. Now, of course, Peterson, and I'm going to get into these in other videos when I can, after I've sufficiently digested this to get short on these things. These are the issues that Peterson is dealing with. So here in Samuel, no talk about Baalism, and Gentiles aren't even a problem. Now, David and Saul are, they follow the Lord. They're not creeping around with Baals. But then when we get to the book of Kings, the Baalism issue is back, and the xenophobia, if that's the way you want to call it, the concern about foreigners is back. And so then you have in the book of Kings, Solomon, who on one hand is the image of exactly what an Israelite king should be. What is he corrupted by? He's corrupted by his foreign wives, and he's corrupted by the foreign gods, and he's corrupted by empire. And this, if there's a theme in the Bible that, especially Americans, how we live in this imperial nation, Americans don't like to engage, it's the ongoing critique of empire and the way that the Bible manages this critique. It's in fact throughout the Bible, and it begins in Genesis 1 and it climaxes in many ways in the book of Revelation. But when you get to the book of Kings, the concern returns to the sin of Jeroboam, and that gets repeated again and again in the book of Kings. And then the prophets arise. This other institution arises to keep the kings in check. Now, I'm going to pause here. I had to pause to pick up this from my blog. Ancient Israelite oracles versus other ancient Near East oracles. And this isn't from another book on John Walton, Ancient Near East Thought and the Old Testament, introducing the conceptual world of the Hebrew Bible. Well, one of the things that you notice is that this Israelite tradition, Israelite indictment oracles are far more common than ancient Near East oracles. Israelite oracles are more often call for covenant faithfulness, while ancient Near East oracles more often call for ritual faithfulness. Israelite prophets are covenant enforcers, while ancient Near East prophets are ritual enforcers. Judgment in the ancient Near East prophecy is nearly non-existent. And so what you have, if I can find my PowerPoint again, enable it. There we go. So what you have in the ancient Near East are prophets are essentially yes men to the kings and the emperors, while in Israel prophets keep railing against the kings and saying, you are failing to embody, to put it in the words of the video we just saw, you're failing to be a good Marduk. You are failing to embody the Lord. You are failing to embody what God has called you to. And this has to do both with their exclusive devotion to their God, loyalty, and to their treatment of the poor and the dispossessed, which gets into what you'll hear Peterson talk again and again about, the big chimp. Now, the big chimp is not the one who's the strongest, who can just simply bully everyone. The big chimp is not only strong, but the big chimp looks out for the females and the young. And this again gets mirrored in the Old Testament. Well, what is the role of the king? The king must do justice. And what does justice require? Justice requires that the land is not just the strong taking the weak. Now, I'm a little slow here. In terms of the video, and I'm sorry the lip sync is off. It's not just the strong taking the weak, it's there has to be justice in the land, and that's where you get into rule of law and all those kinds of things. Now what happens with Israel is that she gets assimilated. Now when Israel is an empire, she's supposed to tolerate and welcome the stranger. But even though there are distinctions, and you can read this again in the Law in Deuteronomy or the Law in Exodus, even though there are distinctions, the Israelites are circumcised, and there are others among them who are not Hebrews and Israelites, and they may not be circumcised. But even though there's distinctions and there's different laws for the different groups, the Israelites are supposed to be open-handed to the poor and open-handed to the stranger, because, and it's said many times, well, you must be open-handed to the stranger because you were a stranger in a strange land, and Egypt, that empire, was not open-handed towards you. But now in comes the big empires. And Assyria comes, and Assyria every empire has a problem. And the United States got a lesson in this when we said, yeah, we can beat Saddam Hussein and we can conquer Iraq, no big deal. And the armies of the United States, went in there and took them over, and especially in the first Gulf War, I mean, the Iraqi soldiers couldn't surrender fast enough. And this demonstrates that what's at the heart of a strong nation is not a tyrant, but it's belief system, because you're not going to fight and die for a country you don't believe in. And well, maybe if the guy behind you has a gun to your head and says, keep moving forward against the enemy or I'm going to shoot you, well, the first chance that person has to get out of there, they're going to do it. So, well, Assyria comes along, and the problem of empire is that, well, you can conquer the people, but then what are you going to do with all those people that you've conquered? And so the U.S. beats Saddam Hussein and kicks him out and controls Iraq, and what happens? Well, pretty soon the Iraqis start fighting with themselves and fighting with the occupiers, and this happens again and again. So Assyria has the plan of divide and conquer. So Assyria decides the best way to deal with this is to take people out of the northern kingdom and spread them throughout their empire, and take other people from their empire and put them in where the Israelites were. And this is the beginning of the Samaritans, which is an issue that you'll find then in Jesus' time. But that's a fairly smart way to go, because Assyria basically says, if we can basically put the people in a blender, we're going to start the clock. They're not going to understand each other language-wise. They're not going to be able to organize. It's divide and conquer, and that way we'll be able to maintain our empire. Now Babylon comes along, and they have a very different idea, and you can hear the roots of this in a lot of what Peterson talks about in terms of Marduk and his eyes around his head and his speech. The Babylonians were, in many ways, they were impressed with themselves, and they were in love with themselves, and their God was the great God. And so, well, how do you assimilate and create a stable empire? Well, you take the brightest and the best from places like Jerusalem, and you bring them to Babylon, and you train them, you enlighten them in what they should be and what they should do. Now, this is, in many ways, the assimilation strategy of imperial America. We give scholarships to people all around the world, and even this current immigration conversation that talks about shithole countries. Well, beyond that is the idea that, well, we're going to take the brightest and the best from all the world, and we're going to bring them to American universities, and they're going to get great degrees, and then they're going to want to move to Palo Alto, California, and work for Google. Isn't that the American dream? Or if you're a Dominican, you're going to play tapa with your ball and your stick, and you're going to make it big in the major leagues. And when you visit the Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, where I lived and worked as a missionary, you're going to come into the airport in Santo Domingo resplendent with gold and chains and show everybody that you've made it. And so Babylon's assimilation strategy was take the brightest and the best of Israel and bring them into Babylon and teach them our ways. And they will surely see that our way of life is better than that backwater Hebrew way of life down there in Jerusalem. And of course, our gods are greater, and their God is some second-rate tribal god. They thought of the God of the Bible kind of like the certain other groups think of, or dismissively think of, the God of the Bible. And so this is how we're going to deal with them. We need to educate them. And this obviously is the great, if you listen to anyone on the left who says, well, the problem is racism. Well, what do we need to do? We need to educate people. And as a Calvinist, I hear that and say, people are not just heads on sticks. People are embodied creatures. They have hearts. They have motivations. They are chimps filled with snakes. You don't educate someone out of racism. You don't educate someone out of hate. This is a problem of the heart, and the heart is far more complex than your notion that, well, if we just give them better ideas, then they'll see the light. That is an extremely deficient anthropology. And again, one of the things I deeply appreciate about Jordan Peterson is that I think his anthropology is far more accurate, and even as a Calvinist, I find his anthropology much more in alignment to my own in terms of the suspicion that we have of people. You don't educate people out of evil. That is not what evil is, and that is not within the capacity of education, because our problem is not too little information. Our problem runs far deeper. So anyway, the idea of the Babylonians was we're going to bring everybody here and we're going to educate them. And you can read in the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel basically chronicles this. Take the brightest and the best of Israel to educate them. But then, of course, the book of Daniel in some ways flips the script. And if you're interested in that, over on my church channel, I did, I think maybe 15 or 16 weeks on the book of Daniel. Fun book. If I were to do that again, I think my treatment of it would be better, because, again, I think Jordan Peterson has been a terrific help in terms of me figuring out the Bible and figuring out the issues and figuring out how all these narratives connect. But then when we get to the Persians after the Babylonians, which we're not really going to get into today, the Persians decide, well, you know what, they're real spiritualists, because the Persians decide, no, it's not education. It's you guys are forgetting your roots, because the spiritual is foundational and the physical is derivative. So let's not think about battle between all the gods. Let's let 1,000 flowers bloom. So you Israelites who got kind of stuck in Babylon, we're going to give you a bunch of money. You go back to Jerusalem and you build your temple and you make your God happy with us. And then you go to the book of Isaiah and you read the most laudatory things about Cyrus. And Cyrus, and this is going to get into what we're about to get into, Cyrus is the servant of the Lord. And you think, oh my, what amazing things to say about an emperor. But read the book of Daniel about, take a careful look at Nebuchadnezzar in that book. And again, you can go through my Sunday school class on Daniel, and I walk through a bunch of this stuff. The characterization of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel is fascinating. So the Persians have a very different approach to assimilation, but we want to focus a little bit on the Babylonian assimilation. And now also in my adult Sunday school class, I've been studying the book of Ezekiel. And you might, if you look at last week's lesson, which we're in early January, actually it was in the process of doing this lesson that a lot of these ideas came into place. And I often have that experience when I'm doing a Sunday school class, that, I do my study in my office, but when I get into the Sunday school class and I start talking about things and my Sunday school class starts talking back and asking questions, new lights come on and I start putting things together. Well, the story of Ezekiel is basically this. Ezekiel is a young man. Well, he's less than 30 years old, and in the priestly class at the age of 30 you're going to be a servant in the temple, and Ezekiel is looking forward to this. But Ezekiel gets hauled up to Babylon in their assimilation project, and Ezekiel gets hauled up to Babylon, and some people actually might think that Ezekiel might have been schizophrenic. And if you read Slate Star Codex, he's got some real interesting things to talk about in terms of disruption, immigration, and schizophrenia. But Ezekiel, his world gets ripped up, and he gets taken up to Babylon, and he starts doing these crazy things, and he starts having these crazy visions. And Ezekiel was one of the last books that the Hebrews, invited and welcomed into their canon, because the book is so strange. And again, if you want to dive into the book of Ezekiel, you can watch my adult Sunday school class. I'm going through it chapter by chapter. And so Ezekiel gets hauled up to this refugee camp outside of Babylon, and his world's just been ripped up. And then he has this crazy vision where the Lord with the cherubim and seraphim appear over by him, and Ezekiel's like, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be in the temple. And no, the Lord moves. What is this? And then he gets these visions of how corrupted the temple is by other deities, and what's going on there. And so this develops, and then we get into the question, how can the Lord be conquered? And what does that mean for its people? Because again, you have the polytheistic religious marketplace. And so pretty much what you have, well, maybe we'll hold off on that. What you have here is, again, the basic situation where the gods are at war. And so the Lord, Israel is the proxy of the Lord, and Marduk is the proxy of Babylon, and Israel and Babylon go to war, and Babylon wins. And what that means is that Marduk is the high god, and the Lord, the God of Israel, is the low god. And so if the Israelites are smart ancient Near East consumers, they're going to say, oh gosh, our God just, didn't do very well, and so we should really, worship the God of Marduk. And Nebuchadnezzar tries to get the Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to do this. He gives them different names. He gives them Babylonian names, and they resist. And now a good polytheist in the ancient world would say, oh, come on. First of all, you don't have to resist. The beauty about polytheism is that if your God gets bested by Marduk, as long as you give props to Marduk, and when the emperor calls you to serve Marduk, you bow down. If you want to go home and continue to think about your little Israelite God, that's okay. We'll look the other way. Everybody has their own little God, and this is the beauty of polytheism. That hey, if one God is good, more God is better. If you have a special God, you can have your own little private world. This is in a sense analogous to kind of the bargain that secularism creates in the West for us. But I don't want to get too lost into that right now. So here you have the polytheistic marketplace, and the Jews are up there. But then this God shows up in Babylon, and he starts changing the script. And then he says things like this. The word of the Lord came to me, son of man, set your face against Jerusalem and preach against the sanctuary. Well, why the sanctuary? Well, that's the temple. And again, if you want to, I go into this in a lot more depth in my adult Sunday school class, and I do have that on YouTube, and I'll put the link to that in this in the notes here. Prophesy against the land of Israel and say to her, this is what the Lord says, I am against you. I will draw my sword from its sheath and cut off from you both the righteous and the wicked. And they say, hey, wait a minute. You're supposed to be God. You're supposed to be about righteousness and wickedness. And Abraham comes to the Lord when he says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham has the audacity to say, will you wipe out the righteous with the wicked? And that then sets up this bartering conversation that they go into. But now, this is the reason that we watch Jordan Peterson, because something happens when the Israelites get defeated, and they now have an existential choice to make. They now have this classic confrontation that many of you made when hey, you grew up in church and you read the Bible stories and you had Adam and Eve and you had the flood and you had all this. And then you went to university, and what did university say? It said, psst, it's all a lie. There's evolution, and there's Darwin, and there's all these things, and your Bible is, your Bible is superstitious, made up by primitive people who didn't know any better. God bless them, but now we know, and so on and so forth. And suddenly you have an existential crisis in your head, and you have to ask yourself, do we serve Marduk? Or do we serve the Lord? And round and round and round and round we go. And one of the things that drives people crazy when they start reading the Bible is, okay, so we start this book of Genesis, and Genesis is really cool, and then we're into Exodus, and Exodus is really cool, and I'm really looking forward to see what happens with Peterson when he gets out of once the Israelites get out of Egypt, and they're in the desert, and then the law comes down, and that's where most people who decide, well, I'm going to read the Bible, so I'm going to read it straight through, so I'm going to start in Genesis. Now, this is a Bible that a homeless guy left on my doorstep. So I'm going to start in Genesis, and then, Exodus, and that's cool with the angel. But then, oh man, Sinai, yeah, but materials for the tabernacle, Sabbath regulations, the golden calf. Well, that's kind of interesting. But and then you've got Leviticus to look forward to. And that's where people are like, oh, I can't read this thing. Well, if they manage to say, okay, we're going to skip Leviticus, some cool stories in Numbers, Deuteronomy, oh, who's going to, that's the law all over again. Joshua, oh, there's some cool stuff at the beginning of Joshua. There's Jericho and Ai and Achan, and that's cool. But then we just get into these silly battles and Numbers, and then Judges, oh, they're kind of cool. And then Ruth, oh, that's a wonderful book, and Kings, Chronicles, and then after you get past Chronicles, you're gonna get into Esther, Nehemiah, Ezra, a little dry. Job, the writings, Job is too long to read. Just read the beginning and the end. Psalms, yeah, I do that before I go to bed. Let's see. But then you're gonna get into the prophets. The prophets, oh my. And the prophets are a big chunk of your Bible. And people can't read them. And why can't they read them? Oh gosh, have you ever tried reading them? What you find is that this kind of thing, like we saw in Ezekiel, is repeated over and over and over and over and over again. And this is the challenge that, my Sunday school class says, oh, let's look at Ezekiel. I say, okay, are you ready for this? Because I'll tell you, there's a lot to it. And it gets dark. And it gets dark fast. And it is like a kid watching, for us, it's like watching our kid watch that video that they watch 20 times a day. And so at some point, you look at the video and say, oh gosh, I'm sick of looking at this video. If my kid plays Pinocchio one more time, I'm going to scream. But then you ask yourself, why is the kid playing Pinocchio 1,000 times? And you say, well, he's working something out. Well, what's he working out? So in other words, what in a sense we have to do is we have to look at these prophets and ask ourselves, what are they working out? Well, they're working out an enormous shift that is the reason why we're still talking and reading this book, and we're not reading the annals of the kings of Babylon. So we read this Bible and we say, why all these laws? Why is this God so angry? Why so much angry prophetic material? And again, if you read Isaiah, and yeah, there's some lovely little pieces in Isaiah that we like to pick out and decorate, hang on our walls at Christmas. But if you read the rest of Isaiah, it's like, oh my goodness, this goes on and on and on. And there's Isaiah, and there's Jeremiah, and there's Ezekiel, and these are huge books. And then you read the minor prophets, and it's like, I have no idea what's going on there. But why does Jordan Peterson repeat himself so often when he's doing these videos? He's doing what we're doing. We're working this stuff out. Why can't we get enough of his videos? Because we're all working this stuff out with him. We're all doing the same thing. And we're sitting there watching the kid watch Pinocchio 1,000 times. So again, this is about gods at war. And you have Israel versus Babylon, which is really Marduk versus the Lord. And then, but now pay attention, this is Marduk. This is the Lord. Why no picture? The story'd be better, right, if the Lord was, looking like maybe Zeus and had a lightning bolt and was going to do something. And then Israel loses. Well, what does that mean they need to do? Well, Marduk. Look at Marduk. He's cool, and look at this. Look at this snake, bird, lion thing that he's beating. That's awesome. And when you go to Babylon and you go in their temple, they have these great pictures and they have these huge statues. And when the Roman emperor came in and to finally destroy the temple, he was looking forward to going in the temple because temples are fun. Temples have pictures. Temples have, they might even have hookers. Temples are cool places. And then he goes into the Hebrew temple, and he is ticked off because he walks into the Holy of Holies, and what's in there? Nothing. Zero. Zip. Nada. Why? Well, this is a word, my friends. This is an image. What's going on? And really what the prophets are doing, and what Ezekiel is doing, and the reason they go over it again and again and again and again and again until we're just sick of it because that's not what we're going through, is that what happens. And if you read the prophets, this is what they come to again and again and again. One of the things that I really appreciate about Peterson that's in that transliminal video is he talks about intelligence. Intelligence is really good. It's really good to be smart. But you know what? To a certain degree, you're only going to be as smart as your genetics allow you to be. And that's kind of a bummer. So, most of us are not going to be anywhere near as smart as Jordan Peterson. It's just not the genetics we were given. It's not the cards we were dealt. Oh, what a pagan saying that is, and Christians use it all the time. It's not the cards we were dealt. But Peterson makes the point in that video, smarts. But you want to know what is a real key to learning and living? Pay attention. Pay attention. You can learn a lot by watching. And so when you see stuff happening and when you see repetition, pause and say, why am I bored with this? Why is this other person not bored with this? What are they working out? What's really going on? So, what happens to the Hebrews? What the Hebrew prophets begin saying is, Babylon is the Lord's tool. And what he's in a sense saying is, well, we're not going to talk about Marduk much because the question about Old Testament polytheism versus henotheism versus the other realms. Who does God talk to at the beginning of the book of Job? And they're Michael Heisner or something like that. He's doing a lot of interesting videos on that. And if you're not familiar with any of that stuff, it's good stuff to watch. But the Lord is the great king. He's the king over other gods. Well, who are these other gods? Well, he's the king over Marduk. And here's where the question of conflict in Genesis 1 gets important, because the Lord doesn't destroy the sea monster. The sea monster serves the Lord. And in fact, if you look at the book of Job, this is, Hasatan, the Satan, the accuser. Satan serves the Lord. Now, how does this work? And now when you get into the New Testament, this conversation is going to get even more engaged, and it's going to get even more engaged when you get into the book of Revelation. But, even Satan is really no challenge to him. This God of the Hebrews is the God of gods. He's the Lord of lords, which was, again, a Roman imperial title. But he has Marduk chasten Israel. And Israel must learn. Marduk is a tool of the Lord, as is chaos. Now, again, what I find so helpful with Peterson is I find, as a therapist, he's used to dealing with people who are dealing with stuff. And as a pastor, I'm used to dealing with people who are dealing with stuff. And he's found, again, following Jung, that people's struggles are not just in their head. And that's why you can't just give them a pill and then everything's fine. There's a man who used to sleep outside my door for about 6 years. And he's bipolar. He's in jail right now. And he's a friend of mine. And actually, this is his Bible. He picked it out of a garbage can in the neighborhood, and it's English and Spanish, so he left it here. So he's my friend, so I kept it. But he's probably not going to get out of jail for a number of years for what he did. But where was I going with this? Yeah, so you deal with people, and Peterson's chaos imagery is in some ways pastoral care gold. This is really helpful in terms of understanding what happens with people, and I want to get into more of that in terms of the transliminal video and what is hell. And I'm also going to have to get into it at some point when we finally deal with Peterson and ontology, because that's where a lot of these conversations are going to get very, very interesting. And I know in terms of talking to people in the Facebook groups, and I do read on Reddit and read a lot of those conversations. I'm always grabbing signals, because as Peterson say, people are information herders. So I'm grabbing this information, and I'm asking questions about, okay, what does this mean? How does this fit together? So anyway, Peterson's chaos theories are, these are pastoral gold, because I see it all the time. People descend into chaos. People live in chaos, and they're trying to bring order to their chaos, and it isn't coming together. Well, the Lord is the master of chaos. Well, gosh, what does that mean? Well, that actually sets up the problem of evil, which is a huge challenge in Christianity. And if you delve into Christianity, you're going to see the problem of evil dealt with again and again. That problem is only set up because the Hebrew God is such a high God. And I've had, for example, there's one dear woman who was a member of my church, but she was, in terms of her background, she was Pentecostal, and she would say things like, well, God doesn't let bad things come into my life. That's the devil doing it. And okay. And she didn't have the interest in having a philosophical conversation with me about dualism. Do you think Satan is kind of an adversary of the Lord? Do you think he's a match? That question gets really complicated in a lot of different ways. But again, the Bible is equipped to talk about these things, and the Bible gives us the language to talk about these things, which is actually one of the points that David Brooks keeps trying to make in terms of his questions about the United States and politics and so on and so forth, but I'm not going to get into that. So, but this idea of chaos, this is pastoral gold, but the Bible talks about chaos and deals with this conversation in a very interesting way. And so now here, Babylon is the bringer of chaos. And what does that mean for Israel? Now, normally, what it would mean in terms of the polytheistic religious marketplace is that Israel now has to bow to Marduk. Israel has to bow to the image. And again, you get into the book of Daniel, and this is exactly what Nebuchadnezzar says. When the band plays, everyone must bow, and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego say, nope, ain't going to do it. And Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, into the fiery furnace you go. And they go into the fiery furnace, and what happens? There's 4 people in there. Well, who's the 4th person? And the one looks like the son of the gods. Well, what is that going on? And then they're taken out of the fiery furnace, and they don't even smell like smoke, and their hair isn't singed. Well, what's going on in that story? What is that story saying? What is that story saying about chaos? Well, the book of the book of Daniel is full of ordeals. And again, if you listen to my Sunday school series on Daniel, I go through this. The book of Daniel is all full of ordeals. And what are ordeals? You take something that is ordered and you throw it into chaos. You take the supposed witch and you throw her into water, and if she floats, she's a witch. And watch Monty Python on that. But you take something that is ordered and you throw it into chaos. You throw Daniel into a lion's den. You throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace. You throw it into, and you see what emerges out of chaos. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego emerge out of chaos unharmed. Why? Because their God is the God who masters chaos. And Leviathan is his pet. And Behemoth is his puppy. And this is the God of the Hebrews. And what does that mean in terms of pastoral care? Well, you're going to have the problem of evil on one hand, and you're going to have to say, well, why is the Lord allowing this chaos into my life? Well, one answer is, well, you probably brought a lot of it on yourself. And that's why a good Calvinist usually begins, okay, what did I do? Not what did I do to deserve this, but yeah, I know I did a lot to deserve this. Okay, but now what must I do? And this is where religion gets its grip, because now suddenly you have a Savior who can engage chaos. Now, just to bring things back into the modern realm, it was very interesting for me during the Gulf War when these pictures were coming out. You know, who did Saddam Hussein think he was? Well, he was Nebuchadnezzar, he imagined. And how did that work out for him? Not terribly well. And what does that mean? Why did he connect with that story? Why do we connect with these stories? Why do we imagine that, you know, actually Saddam Hussein was a lousy Marduk? And in a sense, you know, Jordan Peterson, we could say Jordan Peterson is a prophet, and well, it's actually after Saddam Hussein, but he probably could have prophesied that Saddam Hussein was a terrible Marduk. And the armies of chaos, which were the United States, blew in there and destroyed him. But then chaos descended upon the land, and, you know, that history is still unfolding. So that's my treatment of, I very much wanted to get into Ezekiel, and I wanted to illustrate some of the ways that Peterson is helping me piece together the Bible, not only how it works as a story, but how the story connects with the world and how it connects in my life. And again, as I had, and I'll put the link of it, I had last Sunday teaching my Sunday school class this epiphany. Why are the Hebrew prophets so repetitive? Well, they are working out this dramatic upheaval, which was, well, here's the funny thing. Whose story are we talking about? Is Marduk? How many temples does Marduk have in Sacramento? How many people are worshiping Marduk in the world today? Well, how many people are how many people are reading the Bible? How many people are reading the Hebrew Scriptures? How many people are looking at the Lord and saying, the Lord, He is God? And so this transformation that Israel does, they should have simply adopted the polytheistic marketplace and said, okay, yeah, we've been beaten. We're the underwolf, and the mean wolf is over there. And so, okay, yeah, you beat me, and then the mean wolf, again, this is Peterson, then the mean wolf says, yeah, you're a slob, but, you know, we're Babylonians, and we have the best culture anyway, so come here and we'll educate you. And this stuff doesn't change. It just keeps happening again and again and again and again. And we look at this old book and we say, oh, we should dismiss it. Well, no. If you read this old book, you might discover something about your life. And it scales. It deals with politics, it deals with metaphysics, and it deals with your personal life. And this is why I have absolutely no regrets that I've decided to spend my adult life and my career studying this book. So thanks for watching. Leave a comment, and hopefully one of these days I'll figure out enough to be able to make some short videos.